Did you know that you can rename a database? Now, you should almost never do this in real production, but it's something that's possible. For example, let's say that JPro code just wasn't an explicit enough name, and you wanted to say this is short for the Joe's to Pros Practice Company. So let's make sure the word practice is in there. Right-click, select Rename, and change the name to J Practice Co. and hit Enter. My system has 4 databases on it. If I wanted to add a 5th database, I would have to choose a name that doesn't already exist. And there's one of several ways to create a database. One of the easiest ways is to go to the Databases folder, right-click, and select New Database. Let's make this a database for movies, and call it DB Movie, and hit OK. We notice there's a 5th database listed here. If I wanted to get rid of the DB Movie database, I'd do a similar process where I right-click, choose Delete, and click OK, and the DB Movie database is gone. Well, that was so much fun. Let's try that again. Right-click, New Database, type DB Movie, click OK, and there it is. Now, if I happen to try to repeat the exact same process, and I choose a name that's been taken before, watch what happens here. It failed to create the database because it already exists. Click OK. Let's again get rid of this database so it's not on our system, and we're going to start fresh and try the exact same exercise by doing code. Okay, now we don't want to have the DB Movie database on our system, and instead of right-clicking the Object Explorer, we're going to open a new query window. It's a good idea that when you're creating a database, you are in a system database known as master. Let's type create database DB Movie and execute. It says completed successfully, and at this point a lot of students in my classes notice, why don't I see it here? Well, you can repaint this screen and get the most updated settings anytime you want by right-clicking and saying refresh. Now you will notice the DB Movie database is listed with the other databases. If we were to take this exact same code and try to create a database that already exists, you get the same error message you got before, but you get it in a message window. So it seems I can only create a database if it's not already there. This create database statement ran successfully because it created a database that didn't already exist. This second one didn't work because the first one already created it. Well, if we put this statement between them, drop, database, DB Movie, and we run this, it drops the database. Now refresh it, and we see that it is not there. Now, run this code again, and it's present. A lot of people ask, why would you create a database, then drop it, then create it again? Often in testing environments, you're going to create a database, run a bunch of tests on it, and then they're going to make improvements and fixes to the database and give it a whole new set of code. Why? To pretend this is day one in production. We want to see how this code works from scratch on a fresh system. The first line of code they give you is probably a drop database statement, so they know the create database statement is going to work. As we start this next example, please notice I have changed my database context to be in the DB Movie database. Well, this looks like a pretty safe bet from what we've learned. We'll drop the database. Once it's dropped, we'll create it. Let's show you a few tricks on how to make this code work and how to make it robust. Let's start off by selecting the first statement that drops the database that currently exists. Let me hit execute, and it says, you cannot drop the database because someone is using it. Who's using this database while I'm trying to get work done? Oh, wait a minute. It's me. I'm currently using the database. You cannot drop the database if your database context is in the database you're currently trying to drop. So let me just quickly change this to master, execute. Here it appears to run fine. Refresh. Now create it. And refresh. Okay, all seems to be well right now. Let's show you a way to solve that occasional bug of trying to drop a database when you're already in that database. Because what if it's somebody else's job to run the script and you're not there to click this drop-down menu? Well, let's leave it on the database. Notice that it runs with an error, which means it doesn't run at all. Let's make it so the context is changed to master without touching that drop-down. Type use master. Highlight this, and as this executes, watch the database context change. Now it's safe to drop the DB movie database. After that, it's safe to create the database. Notice that creating the database took longer than dropping the database. Okay, let's move a little further along, and let's say that we're in the master database, so we can drop a database called DB movie, and then we can create a database fresh called DB movie. Let's use this database now that it exists. Let's run these statements individually. Use the master, drop the database, create the database. Now let's use it, which changes our context to the DB movie database, which is very handy for our next create table statement or our next select statement. We know exactly what database our next statement is going to use. As good as this code is, sometimes it will error out and sometimes it won't. This is due to a little bonus that SQL Server offers us by trying to run multiple lines of code at the exact same time. For example, it's possible that the second line of code will run at the exact same time as the first line of code. Well, if this statement actually finishes first, before the database has been dropped, you'll get a duplicate database error message like we saw earlier in this video. So what you want to do is you want to make sure each statement has completely finished in a batch before the next one can start. For example, I want to fully make sure that I am in the master database before I even think of dropping the database. So what I'm going to do is use master, and I'm going to wait until I'm completely done with that, and then go. Now, go doesn't mean execute your query. This little execute button does. Go means as soon as the statement above completely finishes executing, then I'm going to go to the next line. So go is actually like a time separator. So let's drop the database, make sure it's completely dropped. Once SQL has made sure it's dropped, and only then will it go. Below this line, only after SQL has completely created the DB movie database will it try to use the DB movie database. Now let me use the database and put another go so the next statement below it knows what database context it's in before it tries to run. Let's execute all of this together. Okay, it ran successfully. Let's see what happens if we take this go out. We get an error message. The reason is, it takes a long time to create a database. It doesn't take very long to use a database. So this use DB movie statement actually ran and completed before the database was created. This means that it errored out because you can't use a database if it doesn't completely exist. Okay, your code's been working great, and it drops and creates the database every time you need a new test of a new redeployment. Now let's say that it's after lunch. Time to run the script again, time to redeploy. You go to lunch and a coworker says, hey, since we're going to do a redeployment, let me go the extra mile and get rid of the DB movie database so that it's no longer on the system. So the user changes to the master database and drops the DB movie database. All gone, ready for a new deployment. You come back from lunch and say, let me use the master database and let me drop the DB movie database. But wait a minute. There's no DB movie database there. That means this code errors out. So this second statement should only run if the database is present. What if somebody else dropped it before you? This line errors out, and if this code runs all together inside of some procedure, that means the third and fourth line of code will never get run, and your redeployment fails. So we want to make the second batch conditional. Run only if dbmovie is present. This comment says I only want the second batch to run if dbmovie is present. So how do we get this second batch to sprout two eyeballs, look into the database list, and see if it's there? Well, let's say that it is there, and it should run. Let me create the database, refresh. We want this drop statement to look to see if it's present. Well, how do you get the code view of the database list in addition to the Object Explorer view? Here's a query from a catalog view that says, select all fields from sys.databases. This lists all of your databases. There's AdventureWorks, DB Basics, JPracticeCo, DB Tester, and if the database is present, you will see it in this catalog view. Let's change this so it just looks for the database we're interested in. Where name equals dbmovie. Is the database dbmovie on the system? Well, according to this query, it is. Now let me drop it. Is the dbmovie database there? No. Let me create it. Is the dbmovie database there? Yes. So what I want to do is take this query you see highlighted and say, if you find a record, then drop it. If you don't find a record, then skip it. So take this entire query and surround it in a set of parentheses. I'm going to get rid of the Object Explorer so we have some more browsing room here. And put the word if exists in front of it. Now this code will run successfully regardless of if there's a database there, because the second line only drops the database if it's there, and completely skips this whole batch if the database is not there, and just creates the database. Now a word to the wise. Take your JPracticeCo and change the name back to JProCo. If you don't, it's going to cause some future reset scripts to fail. Lab 5.1, Skill Check 1. Create a script using 4 separate batches. Now remember, batches are separated by the word go. The first batch will use the master database. The second will drop the DB skill check database, if it exists. The third will create the database. And the fourth will use the database context. When you're done, your screen should resemble the figure you see here. That completes Lab 5.1, Creating Databases. Next up, Lab 5.2, Creating Tables.